You're leaving to what? Consult. My boss, Julian Vance, didn't just laugh. He threw his head back and barked, a loud, incredulous sound that bounced off the glass walls of his corner office. The city skyline was spread out behind him like a trophy he owned. Isabel, let me be blunt, for your own good. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to that familiar, condescending tone he used when he was about to mentor me. You're a brilliant analyst. You're the best researcher I have. You're a perfect number 2. But you are not a rainmaker. You're not a client facer. You're an engine, not a driver. I stood there, my resignation letter, 2 simple professional lines, sitting on his polished mahogany desk. I had just spent 72 sleepless hours untangling the absolute mess he had made of the Omnicorp deal, and he had presented my solution to the board as his own, not 2 hours ago. He picked up my letter as if it were a dirty tissue. You think you can just go out there and survive on your own? The world is brutal. This name, he tapped the Crestview Capital logo on his desk, means something. It protects you. Out there, without me, without this firm, you're nothing. You'll be back in 6 months asking for your old job. He tossed the letter into his waste bin. I'll give you a week to reconsider this little moment of panic. I just looked at him. I looked at the man who had taken credit for my work for 5 straight years. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just smiled, a small, polite smile. That won't be necessary, Julian. My mind is made up. Fine, he shrugged, already turning back to his monitor, dismissing me. It's your funeral. Don't call me when you fail. You'll never survive without this company. I walked out of that office. He was right. I was a brilliant analyst, and my analysis had shown me that Crestview Capital was hemorrhaging its best clients, not because of bad markets, but because of Julian's arrogance and laziness. What he didn't know was that the Omnicorp deal I'd just saved had given me a direct personal line to their CEO. What he didn't know was that their CEO and 2 other clients I'd personally managed were leaving with me. And what he definitely didn't know was that 5 years later, after his rainmaking ran dry and his company had been sold for parts, he would be sitting in my lobby, resume in hand, waiting for an interview. My name is Isabel. My boss warned me I'd never survive without this company. Now he works under mine, but I need to back up. I need to explain how we arrived at that moment. The cruelty of that Tuesday, the arrogance of his warning, didn't appear out of nowhere. It had been building for 5 years. 5 years of small cuts, tiny thefts of credit, and the slow, grinding erosion of my professional worth. For 5 years, I was the ghost in Julian Vance's machine. My official title at Crestview Capital was Senior Quantitative Analyst. It was a respectable title, the one I had earned with my master's in financial mathematics. It was a title that I had at first been incredibly proud of. My real job, however, was Julian Vance's fixer. And my day didn't end at 5 p.m. It usually began. My real work started after Julian had finished his client-facing duties, his 3-hour steak lunches at the Palm, his rounds of golf at the club I couldn't afford to join, his networking cocktails where he'd slap backs and make promises. He was the driver, as he'd said. He was the one who schmoozed and smiled. It was my job to make sure those promises weren't catastrophic lies. He would leave the office at 4:30 p.m., usually with a breezy, "Great work today, team," shouted to the open plan office. He never said my name. It was always team. Then at 7 p.m., my email would ping. It would be a 90-slide presentation deck he'd built for a major client, like Omnicorp, and the subject line would be the same familiar, lazy request. "Isabel, can you just check these numbers before the morning?" He wasn't asking me to check the numbers. He was asking me to do the numbers. I would open the deck and my blood would run cold. The executive summary on slide 1 would be full of confident, muscular buzzwords, synergistic leverage, market-leading projections, optimized alpha. Then I'd get to the data on slide 12, And it would be wrong, not just a little wrong. It would be catastrophically, fundamentally, lazily wrong. He'd have copy-pasted revenue projections from last quarter, forgetting to adjust for the new market data from Asia. He'd have run a risk model that didn't account for the new interest rate hikes. His entire analysis, the foundation of his visionary strategy, was a house of cards built on sloppy, arrogant guesswork. And so I would fix it. I would spend the next 6 hours alone in that dark office, the cleaning crew's vacuum humming in the distance, fueled by stale vending machine coffee and quiet, simmering rage. I would delete his data. I would pull the real data from the terminals. I would rebuild the models from scratch. I would rewrite his executive summary, carefully replacing his buzzwords with actual analysis, while making sure to keep his tone so he could still believe he wrote it. I would find the competitor's move he hadn't seen. I would find the regulatory risk he had ignored. I would find the one tiny, brilliant insight in the data that would make the client think he was a genius. I would save him, night after night, week after week. The 72 hours before my resignation, the Omnicorp deal, as he called it, was the worst it had ever been. He had promised the client a 12% return on a new derivative product. He'd done it over golf, with a handshake. The real numbers, my numbers, showed a 4% return, tops, with a 30% risk of total collapse. He hadn't just been optimistic, he had been reckless. He was selling them a fantasy. It took me 3 days, working 20 hours a day to find a way. I barely slept. I ate dry cereal out of a box at my desk. I had to restructure the entire deal, create a new hedge, find a new obscure asset class to balance the risk. I created an entirely new financial product from scratch, just to make his lie look like the truth. I finished at 4 a.m. on Tuesday. I emailed him the final deck. It was a work of art. It was, quite possibly, the most brilliant piece of analysis I had ever done. At 9 a.m. he presented it to the board. I wasn't invited. I was too junior for the executive boardroom. At 11 a.m., the congratulatory email went out from the partners. A huge congratulations to Julian Vance for his innovative and brilliant save on the Omnicorp account. A true rainmaker. I stared at the email. I read it and reread it. Not my name, not Isabel's team. Just Julian. That was when I stood up, walked to my desk, and typed my 2-line resignation letter. That was when he had laughed at me. "You're an engine, not a driver," he'd said. "You'll never survive without me." And that was the moment I looked at the man who had built his entire career on my work. And I made a decision. If I was just an engine, then I would give him exactly what he asked for. I would follow his new rule. I would stay in my lane. I would do my job, only my job, and I would watch him learn how to drive. The next morning I woke up before my alarm. That cold, clear feeling from his office was still there. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. I had 2 weeks left on my notice, 2 weeks to comply. I didn't go in at 7 a.m. I went to the gym. I made breakfast at home. I arrived at the office at 8:50 a.m. I sat at my desk, opened my terminal, and began my work. I ran the daily risk models. I compiled the market summary. I did my job as described in my employment contract, to the letter. I didn't look for the hidden insights. Or I didn't reformat the data to make it look prettier. I just ran the numbers. At 10:15 a.m., the first email pinged. It was from Julian. "Isabel, the Q4 projections for the pension fund clients are wrong. They look thin. Can you add the usual color? I'm presenting a 2. I knew what color meant. It meant my analysis. It meant finding the hidden upside he was too lazy to look for. It meant adding the Isabel magic. I typed a reply. "Julian, the raw data is accurate. The projections are based on the standard model we discussed. I'm busy with the European market analysis as requested." And I sent it. My heart was pounding. I had never, not once, said no. His icon on the chat app immediately turned green. A message popped up. "What do you mean, that's it? Where's the rest of it?" I typed, "That is the complete analysis, Julian. Good luck at 2. I saw the 3 dots. Julian is typing. Appear, and then disappear. He was confused. He was the bully who had pushed someone, and for the first time, they didn't fall over. I went back to my work. At 2:30 p.m., I heard the elevator doors ding, followed by the sound of his heavy, angry footsteps. He stormed past my desk without looking at me and slammed his office door. The glass wall shivered. A minute later, an email from one of the pension fund managers hit my inbox. Julian had been CC'd. "Julian, this presentation was a waste of time. These are just the public numbers. Where is the Crestview analysis? Where is the insight? This is the laziest work I've ever seen from your firm. We're re-evaluating our position." I read the email. I felt nothing. I took my lunch break. By Friday, day 4 of my malicious compliance, the cracks were showing everywhere. The engine was no longer fixing the car while it was in motion, and the driver was steering it directly off a cliff. He was a mess. His expensive Tom Ford suits were rumpled. His rainmaker smile was gone, replaced by a pinched, panicked look. He was snapping at the junior analysts. He was yelling on the phone. The invisible support system that had made him look like a star was gone. The 10 p.m. client calls from Asia, the ones I used to take from my apartment, they were now going straight to his voicemail. He came in one morning complaining he'd been woken up at 3 a.m. by a furious client from Hong Kong who didn't understand time zones. The pre-meeting prep, the one-page summaries I used to write for him, predicting every question a client might ask, they no longer appeared on his desk. He was going into meetings blind, and he was getting slaughtered. I heard him in a meeting in the glass conference room next to my desk. A client asked, "But what's your hedge against the new German regulatory shift?" And Julian just froze. He had no answer. He didn't know because I hadn't told him. And the reports. Oh, the reports. I continued to deliver my work, pure, unadorned, 100% accurate data, but I stopped fixing his. The mid-quarter review for the board was his responsibility. I simply emailed him my data as Appendix B. He didn't read it. I knew he wouldn't. He just copy-pasted his usual buzzwords, attached his name, and sent it to the partners. The fallout was immediate. A partners-only meeting was called. I saw them through the glass walls. Julian, standing there, pale and sweating. The senior partners, old men with cold eyes pointing at the report. Julian was a driver who had never learned to read a map. He was a rainmaker who had no idea how to read the weather. He had built his reputation on my work, and now, without it, he was exposed as the fraud he had always been. I sat at my desk, running my risk models. I was terrified, of course. I was a single woman, and I had just set a match to my only source of income. My resignation was real. My plan was just a hope, but I was also liberated. I was watching a man who'd been driving a car with his eyes closed suddenly realize he was the one who had to steer. The following week, the atmosphere was funereal. We lost the pension fund, a $300 million account. Gone. The whispers started. "What's wrong with Julian?" "He's lost his touch. He seems off." He was a different man. The confident, arrogant bully was gone. He was now a terrified, cornered animal. He would walk by my desk and not look at me, but I could feel the hatred radiating off him. He knew, on some level, that I was the cause, but he couldn't prove it. I was doing my job perfectly. The 3-week mark was approaching. My last day was Friday. It was Thursday, 6 p.m. I was packing my personal items into a small cardboard box, my degree, a photo, my favorite pen. The office was almost empty, and that's when he appeared, not with a shout, but with a whimper. He was just standing at my desk. "Isabel." His voice was hoarse. I looked up, feigning mild surprise. "Julian, what can I do for you?" I just got off the phone with Omnicorp. with their CEO, Mr. Harrison. He was rubbing his temples, his eyes closed. He's furious. He said the new projections I sent him are unacceptable. He said they're lazy. He said, whatever Isabel did last month, this isn't it. He looked at me, and his eyes were desperate. All the arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, pathetic panic. I don't know what's wrong, Isabel. The numbers, they don't sing anymore. The clients, they're not listening to me. I need you to fix it. Whatever it is you do, that is magic you do. I need you to do it now. He was the man who had told me I was just an engine. And now he was standing in front of me, begging me to save him because his car was on fire and he didn't know how to open the hood. I looked at him. Really looked at him. This was the driver. This was the rainmaker. This was the man who, just 3 weeks ago, had dismissed my entire career, my entire mind, as a secondary function. He wasn't a leader. He was a passenger in a car I had been building and driving for him, and now that I had taken my hands off the wheel, he was terrified. He wasn't asking for help. He was asking for a tow. He was asking me to go back to being the engine so he could pretend to steer again. I felt that cold, clear certainty settle in my chest. The pity was gone. All that was left was the clarity of the exit. I closed my market report. The click of the mouse was the only sound. I'm afraid I can't, Julian. He blinked. It was a slow, confused blink. What? What do you mean you can't? Isabel, this is Omnicorp. This is your job. No, Julian, I said. My voice was calm, not cold, not angry, just factual. My job was senior quantitative analyst. I ran the models. I compiled the data. I did that. My work was 100% accurate. What you're asking for isn't analysis. It's magic, as you said. I stood up, slowly, and began to gather my personal items. The small silver picture frame. The pen I liked, my noise-cancelling headphones. You told me yourself, I continued, that I need to stay in my lane. You said I'm the engine. You're the driver. This fixing. This is a driver's problem, Julian. And you're the driver. His face went from pathetic to purple in a split second. The panic was still there, but now it had a new, ugly partner. Rage. He wasn't begging anymore. He was cornered. You did this, he hissed. I did my job, Julian. I gave you the raw, accurate numbers. This is sabotage! His voice was no longer a whisper. It was a sharp, ugly shout. Across the office, the 2 junior analysts who were working late froze. Mark, the VP, who had been zipping his briefcase, stopped. He turned. They were all watching. Julian was too panicked to notice. He was completely unraveling. You ungrateful. I made you. I plucked you from the analyst pool. I gave you all this responsibility and you throw it back in my face. You're nothing without this firm. You'll never survive. He slammed his hand on my desk, rattling my empty coffee cup. You think you can just walk out of here after what you did? I will call every firm in this city. I will make sure you never get a job as a bank teller. You'll be nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing. He was ranting now, his finger pointed at my face. He was threatening me with a future I was no longer afraid of. He was a king in a burning castle, threatening his subjects with the smoke. I just looked at him, my face calm. I didn't say a word. I let his threats hang in the empty, silent office. I let the witnesses listen, and then my desk phone rang. The sound, a simple digital beep-beep, cut through his tirade like a knife. He stopped, mid-rant, his mouth open. I looked at the caller ID. It was the external line. Mr. Harrison from Omnicorp, right on schedule. I smiled, a real, genuine smile, not the polite, pained mask I'd worn for 5 years. I picked up the receiver, my hand steady. Good evening, Mr. Harrison, I said, my voice warm and professional. Yes, I was just finishing up packing my desk. No, he's just finishing up as well. Yes, I have the final transition documents right here. I swiveled in my chair, turning my back to Julian, giving my full attention to the call. I saw Julian's reflection in the dark glass of the window. He was frozen. His hand was still in the air. He looked at the phone, then at me. The color drained from his face. He finally understood. He had been so busy shouting, he'd never once wondered why I was leaving, or where I was going. "Yes, sir. I'm very excited about it," I continued into the phone. "Vantage Point Analytics is ready to hit the ground running. Having Omnicorp as our foundational client is an incredible honor. Yes, I agree. The new risk model will be much more effective once we cut out the intermediary layers." Julian made a small, strangled sound. "Vantage Point Analytics, my new company. Omnicorp, his client." He looked at Mark, the VP, who was watching this whole scene with a look of stunned, almost comical disbelief. I turned back around in my chair, a bright, helpful smile on my face. "Oh, Julian," I said, covering the receiver. "It's Mr. Harrison, from Omnicorp." I held the phone out to him. "He'd like a word with you. He wants to thank you, and for me. He said my work was so good. He's moving his entire account to my new firm. He's terminating his contract with Crestview." Julian stared at the phone as if it were a snake. He didn't take it. He couldn't. His entire carefully constructed world had just collapsed in on him. He had lost his engine. He had lost his biggest client. And he had lost his temper in front of a vice president. He looked at me. His eyes were no longer angry. They were just empty. He turned, his expensive suit looking cheap and rumpled, and he walked back to his corner office. He didn't slam the door. He just closed it. It was the quietest, most final sound I had ever heard. I brought the phone back to my ear. "I'm sorry about that, Mr. Harrison. He seems busy. Now, about that transition plan." I finished the call, my voice never shaking. I put my last few items into my small cardboard box. Mark, the VP, walked over. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at Julian's closed door, then at me. He nodded once. "Good for you, Isabel," he said, his voice low. "He never deserved you. He never deserved any of us. You're taking Omnicorp with you." "Yes. And the XT account." I just smiled. Mark laughed, a real, genuine laugh. "Good for you. You're not just surviving, Isabel. You're going to fly." I smiled at him. "Thank you, Mark. Have a good night." I picked up my box. As I walked toward the elevator, I could see the two junior analysts staring at me, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. My boss had warned me I'd never survive. But as I walked out of that office for the last time, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving, and I was taking his entire future with me. I walked out of that elevator and onto the street. The air had never felt so cold or so clean. The victory was total. It was complete. But it was only the first step. The title promised that he would work under me. That doesn't happen overnight. The next 5 years were the hardest of my life. Vantage Point Analytics was born in my 600-square-foot apartment on a dining room table that wobbled. Omnicorp was my foundational client. Mr. Harrison was true to his word, but one client isn't a company. It's just a job with a new temporary boss. Julian, I learned, was right about one thing. I was not a rainmaker. I was an analyst. I hated networking. I hated the sell. I hated the schmoozing, the golf games, the steak lunches. My first 6 months I was terrified. I was burning through my savings. I lost 2 potential clients because my presentations were too honest. I gave them the data, and the data wasn't what they wanted to hear. "You need to sell the sizzle, Isabel," one of them told me, "not just the math." I almost failed. I almost became the statistic Julian had predicted. I was sitting at my dining table at 3 a.m., staring at my dwindling bank account, when I got a call. It was Mark, the old VP from Crestview. "Heard you're struggling to land the next client," he said. "The word is out that I'm not a rainmaker," I said, exhausted. "No," Mark said. "The word is out that you're honest, that you're the engine. Stop trying to be Julian. Be Isabel. The clients who want a show will go to him. The clients who want to win will come to you." He was right. I stopped trying to be a driver. I doubled down on being the best engine in the world. I didn't make cold calls. I published my analysis. I wrote white papers. I put my work out into the world, not my personality. And slowly, they started to come. First, it was the Aperture Dynamics account. They were a mid-level logistics company. I found a 15% inefficiency in their shipping routes that their current firm had missed. I didn't send them a sales deck. I sent them the solution. I got the contract the next day. While I was building, Crestview was dying. The rumors were quiet at first. Julian's lost his touch. They're bleeding clients. They lost the pension fund. He'd been the driver of a car he didn't know how to build, and without me, his engine, he'd been running on fumes. I hired my first employee. Then 3. I moved from my dining table to a 2-person co-working space, then to a small 4-person office. Then, 3 years in, to our first full floor. Vantage Point Analytics was real. It was profitable. It was respected. I built it on one principle: no drivers, only engines. We were a company of analysts for analysts. We didn't sell sizzle. We sold the truth. And then the call came. It was from a bankruptcy trustee. Crestview Capital was insolvent. It was being sold for parts. Julian Vance, the great rainmaker, had made it rain so little that his entire empire had dried up and blown away. I hung up the phone. I looked out the window of my new office, the office I had built. A year later, my company had grown so fast, we needed a new, larger space. The trustee called me again. "You're not going to believe this," he said, "but the old Crestview Capital office is available. The bank seized it. It's cheap." I smiled. "I'll take it," I said. We moved Vantage Point Analytics into the 40th floor. We ripped out the dark mahogany, the heavy carpets. We put in glass and light and open-plan desks. I took Julian's old corner office. I took his view. And that's when my new head of HR, Sarah, walked in. "Isabel, we're ready for the final round of interviews for the junior data analyst position." "Great," I said. "Who's on the list?" "A few good candidates straight out of college, and one interesting one. An older applicant. A lot of experience, though. It looks like he's been consulting independently for a few years." "What's his name?" I asked, looking over the Redwood Holdings report. "Julian," she said. "Julian Vance." My pen stopped. "Julian Vance," I repeated. I looked up. "Yes," Sarah said, looking at her tablet. "He applied through the standard portal. His resume is, well, it's impressive, if a little dated. He was a partner at Crestview Capital. Is that right? Before they went under?" "Yes," I said, the word cold. "That's right. He's in the lobby. He seems, nervous. Are you ready for him?" I took a deep breath. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of my monitor. 5 years. 5 years of 20-hour days, sleepless nights, payroll anxieties, and brutal, terrifying risk. It had all led to this. "Send him in," I said. The music of my life, the frantic, anxious rhythm of building a company, seemed to stop. The world went silent. I was waiting. The door opened, and Julian Vance walked in. My first thought was, he got old. It wasn't just that 5 years had passed. It was a different kind of aging. The arrogant, powerful driver I remembered was gone. The man who walked into my office was a ghost. His suit. It was the first thing I noticed. He used to live in $3,000 Tom Ford suits. This was something else. It was a cheap polyester blend suit, slightly too large in the shoulders, in a sad shade of charcoal grey. It was clean, but it was worn. The cuffs were slightly frayed. He was thin. The confident, athletic build he'd had from lunchtime tennis matches at the club was gone. He looked deflated. His hair was thinner, greyer at the temples. But the worst part was his posture. He, who had commanded every room he entered, walked in with his shoulders slumped, his eyes cast down. He was holding a worn leather portfolio, clutching it to his chest like a shield. He stopped in the middle of the room, on my Persian rug. He looked around. He looked at the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked at the desk I was sitting behind. I knew what he was thinking. This wasn't just an office. This was his old office. Crestview Capital had gone bankrupt 3 years ago, and in a poetic twist of fate, I had taken over their lease. This was literally his old desk. "Julian," I said. My voice was even, calm. "Thank you for coming in. Please sit." He almost flinched at the sound of my voice. He shuffled forward and sat in the chair opposite me, the chair where I used to sit 5 years ago taking his abuse. He sat on the very edge of it, as if he were afraid to get comfortable. "Isabel," he said, and his voice was hoarse. He cleared his throat. Thank you for seeing me. Your office, it's very nice. You've done well." "Thank you," I said. I did not smile. This was not a reunion. It was an interview. I opened his resume, which was already on my screen. "So, Mr. Vance," I said, using the formal title, "let's talk about your resume. It's impressive. Partner at Crestview Capital for 10 years. He winced at the name. "Yes, that's correct. And for the last 3 years, it looks like you've been consulting independently." His eyes darted to my screen, then back to my face. He knew that I knew. Consulting independently was the polite term for unemployed and toxic. After Crestview imploded, taking several pension funds with it, his Rainmaker name had become poison in the industry. "Yes," he said, a faint blotch of red appearing on his neck. "The market has been difficult. I've been selective, looking for the right fit." "I see." I scrolled down the screen. "And the right fit for you, a former partner at a major capital firm, is a junior data analyst position at Vantage Point." He had to swallow. I watched his throat move. This was it. This was the moment he had to say it. I'm looking to get back to the fundamentals," he stammered. Get my hands dirty again. Back to the work. I miss the analysis. The engine room." My God. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. The man who had mocked me for being an engine was now desperately trying to become one. I leaned back in my chair. I steepled my fingers, just as he used to do. "That's interesting, Julian, because this is an engine room job. I need to be very clear about that. This isn't a client-facing role. There are no golf lunches. There are no presentations to the board." I leaned forward, my voice becoming sharp and precise. "This position is a number 2 role. You will be supporting our senior strategy team. You will run the numbers they ask for. You will analyze the data they provide. You will be building the models, not presenting them. The hours are long, the work is often tedious, and the credit is shared. It's a support role. You'll be in a cubicle, Julian, not an office. Are you comfortable with that?" I had just read his insults back to him, repackaged as a job description. I watched him process it. He knew exactly what I was doing. His face went pale, then red, then pale again. I could see the war behind his eyes, the rage, the humiliation, and the pure, desperate need. He needed this. He needed the paycheck. He needed the health insurance. He looked down at his lap, at his old, worn-out suit. When he looked back up, the last flicker of the Rainmaker was gone. He was just a broken, unemployed man. "Yes," he whispered. I'm very comfortable with that. I just want to work, Isabel. I'm good at the analysis. I was always good at it. I got distracted." "You were never good at it," I thought. "I was." "I see," I said. I was done. The interview was over. I had seen what I needed to see. I closed the folder on my desk. Thank you for your time, Mr. Vance. It's been illuminating. Sarah will be in touch with you regarding our decision. He stood up, his legs looking a little shaky. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, Ms. Thorne. He used my last name. Not Isabel. Ms. Thorne. He walked out of my office. He didn't look back. The door clicked shut. I sat there, alone in my corner office, listening to the quiet hum of my company. A minute later, Sarah, my head of HR, came in. She closed the door, her eyes wide. "Wow," she said, her voice low. "That was the most intense interview I have ever witnessed. He looks terrible. I mean, wow." "So, are we sending him the polite rejection email?" I turned in my chair to look out the window, at my city. "No," I said. Sarah was confused. "No, but Isabel, he's Julian Vance. He's toxic. And isn't he the—" "Yes," I said. "He's the one. He's the one who told me I'd never survive without him. He's the one who took credit for my work for 5 years. He's the one who called me a number 2 who couldn't drive." "So, you're definitely not hiring him," Sarah said, looking relieved. I turned back to her. I smiled, a cold, clear, strategic smile. "Oh, Sarah, of course I'm hiring him." Sarah's mouth dropped open. "You're— what?" "I'm hiring him. I want you to offer him the exact base salary for a junior analyst, not a penny more. I want him to have the smallest cubicle, the one near the printer." "Isabel, I don't understand. Why? Why would you do that?" I looked at Julian's crumpled resume on my screen. "Because, Sarah, firing him would be a mercy. Letting him fail would be an ending. I'm not interested in ending it. I want him to come here every single day. I want him to sit in that cubicle. I want him to run the numbers for the senior analysts I trained. I want him to watch me walk by on my way to the board meetings he used to attend. I want him to sit there in the engine room and see every single day what the engine built after she cut the driver loose." I stood up and walked to the window. He warned me I'd never survive without his company. He's about to find out if he can survive inside mine. Send him the offer letter. He started on a Monday. I didn't see him arrive. Sarah, my head of HR, handled his onboarding. She told me later that he was the first person in the building waiting by the elevators at 8:15 a.m. for a 9 a.m. start. He was wearing the same cheap, worn suit from the interview. He looked desperate. I made my first pass through the office at 9:30, holding my morning coffee, on my way to my first strategy meeting. The bullpen at Vantage Point is open plan. Bright, white, full of glass and light and energy. The exact opposite of Crestview's dark, heavy mahogany tombs, which had been designed to feel like a 19th century bank. And there he was. Sarah had followed my instructions to the letter. He was in the analyst pod, an area of 6 identical low-walled cubicles. His was the one I had specified, the one directly next to the high-volume industrial printer and the recycling bins. He was small. He looked shrunken. He was just sitting there, his hands placed flat on his knees, staring at the blank monitor. He hadn't even been given his login credentials yet. He was just waiting, an irrelevant ghost in a machine that wasn't his. At 9:45, I saw Alex, my senior data strategist, go over to him. Alex is 26 years old. He's a data modeling genius I hired straight out of MIT. He has zero patience for inefficiency, and he has absolutely no idea who Julian Vance used to be. To him, he's just Jules, the new intern, the old guy. I watched from the glass wall of my corner office, sipping my coffee. I could see the interaction, though I couldn't hear the words. I watched Alex hand Julian a laminated sheet. I could imagine the conversation. Alex, all brisk, youthful energy, and Julian, the broken former rainmaker. "Okay, Julian, right? Welcome to Vantage. I'm Alex. I'll be your team lead. First, let's get you logged in. Your first task is to read the compliance manual. It's thick, Second, the kitchen. You brew the pot, you make a new one, I'm not kidding. Third, your first assignment will be the Omnicorp historical data transfer. It's grunt work, but it has to be done. I watched Julian, the man who once commanded boardrooms, the driver, nodding earnestly. He was taking notes. He was taking notes on how to use the coffee machine, while being trained by a 26-year-old who was young enough to be his son. He was completely, utterly broken. The arrogance was gone. The condescension was gone. All that was left was this raw, terrified compliance. He needed this job. He needed the $48,000 a year I was paying him. He needed the health insurance. I walked out of my office to go to the main conference room for my 10 a.m. executive meeting. My path took me right past his new desk. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't look at him. I just walked past, my heels clicking on the polished concrete floor. But I felt him see me. I felt his eyes lock onto the back of my head. The head of his former analyst, now his ultimate boss, walking to a meeting he would never be invited to. I felt him shrink. I felt the air get cold around his desk. I heard the printer next to him whir to life, a loud, jarring sound. He didn't say anything. He wouldn't dare. He just watched me go. The rest of the day, he was a ghost. Just a man in a cheap suit typing. I got the summary from Alex later that evening. Alex came into my office looking confused. "So, the new guy, Julian," he said, flopping into a chair. "He's weird, very quiet. But he's slow." I gave him the first task, the Omnicorp historical data. "The historical data?" I asked, pretending not to know. "You mean the old Crestview reports?" "Yeah, exactly. It's a nightmare. Crestview's data formatting was garbage. We have to manually cross-reference all the 2018-2020 invoices and reports and port them into our system. It's just grunt work, thousands of lines of data entry. It'll probably take him a week, but he just stared at it, like he didn't know where to start." I knew why. Of course he didn't know where to start. He had never seen the raw data. He had only seen the magic I'd performed on it. He had never, not once, done the actual work. I just nodded at Alex. "Good. Keep him on it. Let's see how he handles the fundamentals. Make sure he logs his hours." I stayed late that night, as I always do. I was finalizing a new acquisition deal. We were buying a small, rival analytics firm. When I left the office at 9 p.m., the bullpen was dark, except for one single flickering fluorescent light. Julian. He was still there, in his cubicle by the printer. His suit jacket was off, draped over the back of his cheap chair. His tie was loose. He was staring, bleary-eyed, at a spreadsheet, his face illuminated by the glow of the monitor. He was checking the numbers. He was, at last, the engine. He was doing the work I used to do. But he wasn't saving the firm. He wasn't a secret genius. He was just the data entry guy, the man in the cubicle, the number 2 to a 26-year-old. I stood there in the shadows for a full minute, just watching him. "You'll never survive without me," he had said. I turned and walked toward the elevator, the sound of his frantic, desperate, slow typing fading behind me. He was in his new lane, and he would stay there. 6 months passed. The shock of seeing Julian Vance in a cubicle by the printer faded. For me and for everyone else. He wasn't Julian Vance, the former partner of Crestview, anymore. He was just Jules, the quiet, sad, old guy in the analyst pod. He was, to his credit, a model employee. He came in at 8:50 a.m. He left at 5:05 p.m. He did his grunt work. He never complained. He took his 30-minute lunch in the cafeteria alone, reading a newspaper. He did his job. He ported the old Crestview data. He cleaned up spreadsheets. He ran the basic models Alex, his 26-year-old boss, assigned him. He never spoke in meetings unless spoken to. He was a broken, compliant, reliable ghost. He was the perfect engine. And because he was so quiet, so beaten, a small, stupid part of me began to feel pity. I had won. I had proven my point. He was humiliated. Maybe, I thought, maybe he had actually learned. That was my mistake. Arrogance isn't a behavior, it's a disease, and Julian's was just in remission. Then the Redwood Holdings deal came across my desk. It was a massive, complex $4 billion merger. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes, high-risk deal that Julian, in his prime, would have loved and would have completely ruined. The risk modeling was intense. I assigned the core team, led by Alex, to run the first-pass analysis. Julian, as the most junior member, was assigned to support. His task was simple: data integrity. He was to clean the thousands of lines of raw data from Redwood's books before Alex's team built the models. It was the most important grunt work we had. For a week, everything was normal. The team was working 18-hour days. I was in the conference room with them until midnight. I noticed Julian was there too. He was quiet, in his corner, just typing. I mistook his presence for diligence. I thought he was just being a good soldier. I was wrong. He wasn't being diligent. He was waiting. On Thursday night at 11:30 p.m., an email hit my inbox. Not from Alex, my team lead. It was from Julian. The subject line, urgent, Redwood strategy, a better approach. My blood ran cold. I opened it. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a data query. It was a 10-page strategy memo. He hadn't just cleaned the data. He had used his access to build his own secret model. He had tried to be the driver again. He had bypassed his team lead. He had bypassed his director. He had emailed the CEO of the company, me, directly at midnight, as if he were still a partner, as if he were my equal. I read the memo, and the pity I'd felt for him vanished, replaced by a cold, familiar disgust. It was Crestview. It was all his old lazy tricks. The memo was full of his signature buzzwords: aggressive leveraging, first mover advantage, synergistic disruption, and his core thesis. It was built on a foundation of pure, arrogant assumption. He hadn't run the real stress tests, he'd guessed. He'd driven. He was advising me to recommend a move that my data showed had a 60% chance of catastrophic failure for the client. He hadn't changed. He hadn't learned. He was still the same lazy, arrogant rainmaker who believed his gut was more important than the math. He thought this memo was his comeback, his audition to get out of the cubicle. He had just handed me his own head on a platter. The next morning, at 9 a.m. sharp, I sent him a one-line calendar invite. My office. Now. He walked in. He was holding his old worn portfolio and a copy of his memo. For the first time in 6 months, there was a flicker of that old, arrogant light in his eyes. He thought this was it. The promotion. The moment I finally recognized his vision. "Ms. Thorne," he said before I could speak. "Isabel, I know I overstepped, but I couldn't let the team miss this. The macro view." "Sit down, Julian." My voice was ice. The light in his eyes flickered. He sat. I didn't look at him. I swiveled my monitor to face him. I pulled up his memo. "I read your approach, Julian. It's bold." A flash of a smile from him. "Thank you. I just think we need to be aggressive." "Then," I said, interrupting, "I pulled the real report." I clicked a window. Beside his memo, I pulled up Alex's team report, the one Julian was supposed to be supporting. "Your aggressive play, Julian, is based on a Q2 projection that completely ignores the new regulatory framework in Asia. You didn't run the stress test on the supply chain. You didn't account for the currency fluctuation. Alex's team did. Your vision would have exposed our client to $500 million in unhedged risk." I turned to look at him. "Your vision wasn't vision, Julian. It was laziness. It was the exact same sloppy, arrogant guesswork that bankrupted Crestview Capital. You didn't do the work, you just drove right off a cliff." His face crumpled. The hope died. It was immediate and total. I was just trying to show initiative." "Initiative?" I said. "No, you were trying to be the driver again, but you seem to have forgotten something. You don't work at Crestview anymore. You work here, and here the engines, the people who actually do the math, are the ones in charge. You bypassed your team lead. You ignored protocol. And you delivered a piece of analysis so fundamentally flawed that if I had acted on it, it would have permanently damaged my company and my reputation. I leaned forward. You are not a driver, Julian. You're a liability. Isabel, Ms. Thorne, please, he whispered. It was one mistake. I need this job, please. And that's the tragedy of it, Julian, I said. You do need this job. But you were so desperate to prove you were better than it, you failed at it. I can't have you on my team. I can't have your ego, your shortcuts, or your disease anywhere near my work. I stood up. This was the end. Your 6-month probationary period is over, Julian. You failed. Please, he said, standing up. He was actually crying. Silent, pathetic tears. Please, Isabel, I'll do anything. I'll just do the data entry. I won't do it again. Please, I have nothing. I lost my condo. I looked at him. The man who had laughed in my face. The man who had told me I was nothing. You're right, I said. You have nothing. I buzzed my intercom. Sarah, can you come to my office, please? You'll need to escort Mr. Vance out. He didn't speak. He didn't fight. He just stood there, a 55-year-old man in a cheap suit, completely and finally broken. The rainmaker had finally run out of rain. He had been warned he wouldn't survive without his old company, but the truth was, he couldn't even survive inside mine. He was, and always had been, nothing. It's been 6 months since I fired Julian. The Redwood Holdings deal, once Alex's team actually ran the real numbers, was a spectacular success. Vantage Point Analytics landed the contract. My team celebrated. We hired 3 new analysts. I never heard from Julian Vance again. He didn't call. He didn't email. He didn't show up at my building. It was as if the final, definitive no had erased him. He had no more cards to play. He had no more arrogance to fuel him. I heard through the grapevine that he'd moved back to his hometown. He was consulting for a small local insurance agency. He was, for all intents and purposes, gone. Sometimes I think about that day in his office, the day he laughed at me. He had warned me I'd never survive without his company. He had warned me I'd be nothing. He thought the world was divided into drivers and engines. He thought the drivers, the loud ones, the ones who took the credit, the ones who went to the lunches, were the only ones who mattered. He never understood that the drivers are useless if the engine is flawed. He never understood that the person who can build the engine is the only one who truly has the power. I built my company on that principle. I hired engines. I hired the quiet ones, the diligent ones, the ones who did the math. I hired the people Julian had overlooked his entire career, and together we built an empire of substance. That's the funny thing about status. Julian thought it came from a title, from an office, from a name on the door. He thought it was something you were given. I learned it was something you build. He wasn't wrong all those years ago. I wasn't near his level. I was, and always had been, far, far above it. Thank you for listening to my story. If you believe that true value comes from the work, not the title, and that no one should be underestimated, show your support by liking this video. Subscribe to this channel so you don't. Example, thank you for listening to my story. If you believe that true value comes from the work, not the title, and that no one should be underestimated, show your support by liking this video. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss another story of justice and empowerment. And if you know someone who needs a reminder of their own worth, share this with them.